The old courthouse stood tall and proud in the center of town. Inside, the worn wooden benches were filled with people waiting their turn. Some looked worried, others bored. But in the front row sat 11-year-old Shanice, her feet barely touching the floor from the big chair she was sitting in. Shanice's hands couldn't stay still. She kept pulling at the sleeves of her faded blue sweater that was a little too big for her small frame. Her hair was neatly braided, but you could tell it had been done days ago. Next to her sat Mrs. Taylor, a tired-looking woman from social services who had met Shanice only an hour before. "Case number 47, called out the court clerk, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. Shanice stood up slowly, her knees feeling weak. Mrs. Taylor gently placed a hand on her shoulder and walked with her to the front of the courtroom. Judge Robert Kensington looked down from his high bench. His face seemed carved from stone, with deep lines around his eyes that had seen thousands of cases come and go. People in town called him the rule book because he never bent the law for anyone. Young or old, rich or poor, everyone got the same treatment from Judge Kensington. "Young lady, do you understand why you are here today?" The judge asked, his deep voice making Shanice shrink back a little. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice so soft that the judge had to lean forward. "Speak up, please," he said, not unkindly but firmly. Shanice cleared her throat. "Yes, sir. I took food from Mr. Wilson's store without paying." The judge looked down at the papers in front of him. "It says here you took bread, peanut butter, and some apples. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir." Shanice's voice was a little stronger now. The store owner, Mr. Wilson, stood off to the side. He was a round man with kind eyes that didn't match his angry words. "This is the third time kids from that neighborhood have stolen from my store this month. Something has to be done, Judge." Judge Kensington nodded and turned back to Shanice. "Taking things that don't belong to you is wrong. Do you understand that?" "Yes, sir," Shanice said, looking down at her worn-out sneakers. "Then I need to know why you did it," the judge continued, his voice still stern but with a hint of something else now, curiosity maybe. The courtroom went quiet. Even the usual shuffling of papers and creaking of chairs stopped. Everyone waited for the girl's answer. Shanice looked up, her dark eyes meeting the judge's for the first time. There was no fear in them now, just simple truth. "I was hungry, sir. We don't have much food at home." Those simple words seemed to hang in the air. The judge's expression changed, just slightly, a small crack in that stone-like face. People in the courtroom shifted in their seats. Mrs. Taylor looked down, a pained expression crossing her face. "And where are your parents?" the judge asked, his voice a touch softer now. "I live with my grandma," Shanice explained. "She works real hard, but her back's been hurting so she missed some days. The money ran out before the month did." She said this matter-of-factly, without tears or drama, as if it was just the way life was. Mr. Wilson, the store owner, was looking uncomfortable now. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Judge Kensington set down his pen. For a moment, he just looked at Shanice. The courtroom remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, heavy with understanding. "Your Honor," Mrs. Taylor began, "perhaps we cooled." The judge held up his hand, stopping her mid-sentence. His eyes never left Shanice. "When was the last time you had a proper meal, young lady?" he asked. Shanice thought for a moment. "Yesterday morning at school breakfast," she answered honestly. "But I gave half my toast to my little brother." Something changed in the judge's face then. It wasn't dramatic, just a softening around the eyes, a slight loosening of his tight jaw. But anyone watching closely could see it. Judge Robert Kensington, the rule book, looked like he was seeing something beyond the case in front of him. No one in that courtroom could have guessed what the judge would do next. Not Shanice. Not Mrs. Taylor. Not even Mr. Wilson, who was now looking more sad than angry. The next words out of Judge Kensington's mouth would surprise everyone and start something nobody expected, least of all Shanice herself. Judge Kensington tapped his gavel gently against the wooden block. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice echoing in the now silent courtroom. He looked directly at Shanice. "Young lady, I'd like to speak with you and Mrs. Taylor in my chambers." People started whispering immediately. This wasn't normal procedure, especially for a simple shoplifting case. The court officer, a tall man with gray hair at his temples, led Shanice and Mrs. Taylor through a side door while the judge disappeared behind his bench. The judge's chambers felt like a different world compared to the cold courtroom. Warm wooden bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick law books and family photos. A window let in soft sunlight that made dust particles dance in the air. The room smelled like old books and coffee. Judge Kensington wasn't wearing his black robe anymore. In his white shirt and dark blue tie, he looked more like somebody's grandfather than the stern man who had been sitting on the bench minutes ago. "Please, sit down," he said, pointing to two comfortable chairs across from his desk. A clock ticked quietly on the wall as Shanice sat down, her legs swinging slightly because the chair was too high. "Would you like some water?" the judge asked, already pouring 3 glasses from a pitcher on his desk. Shanice nodded and took the glass with both hands. She drank it quickly, and the judge refilled it without a word. "Now," he said, sitting down in his own chair, "I'd like to hear more about your situation at home, Shanice. Just the truth, okay? You're not in any more trouble." Mrs. Taylor started to speak, but again the judge held up his hand. "I'd like to hear from Shanice first, if you don't mind." Shanice put her glass down carefully on a coaster. "My grandma takes care of me and my little brother Tommy since Mom passed 3 years ago," she began. Her voice was small but clear. "Grandma works cleaning offices at night and helps at the laundromat during the day when her back isn't too bad." Judge Kensington nodded, listening closely. He didn't interrupt or write anything down. He just watched Shanice's face as she spoke. "We were doing okay until last month when the help we get for food got cut." The letter said something about a mistake in the paperwork. Shanice shrugged. "Grandma tried to fix it, but she had to miss work to go to the office, and they told her to come back with more papers. We ran out of food 3 days ago, except for Tommy's cereal." The judge's eyebrows came together, making a deep line between them. "And where is your brother now?" "At the neighbor's. Mrs. Johnson watches him when Grandma's working. She gives him lunch sometimes," Shanice explained. Mrs. Taylor finally spoke up. "Your Honor, I've just been assigned this case today. I haven't had a chance to do a home visit yet, but—" "How many cases do you have right now, Mrs. Taylor?" the judge interrupted. Mrs. Taylor looked surprised by the question. 47 active cases, sir." 47 families or 47 children?" "Families, Your Honor." Her voice was tired. "Budget cuts last year reduced our department staff by 30%. The judge turned back to Shanice. "The food you took, was it just for you?" Shanice shook her head. "For Tommy too, and Grandma. She doesn't eat sometimes so we can have more, but then she gets too tired to work good." Something flickered across the judge's face, a mix of sadness and something else, something harder to name. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a granola bar. "Would you like this while we talk?" Shanice hesitated, then took it with a quiet thank you. She opened it carefully, making sure not to tear the wrapper too much. "Is your grandmother at work now?" the judge asked. "Yes, sir. She doesn't know I took the food. She told me to wait until Friday when she gets paid, but Tommy was crying 'cause his tummy hurt." Shanice took a small bite of the granola bar, chewing slowly like she wanted to make it last. The judge leaned back in his chair. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder in the silence. He looked at the family photos on his desk, then back at Shanice. "Mrs. Taylor," he said finally, "I'm going to do something unusual here." He reached for his phone. "Could you please get Mr. Wilson back in here?" and call the court clerk. "Tell him I need to clear my afternoon schedule." Mrs. Taylor looked confused but nodded and stepped outside. "Shanice," the judge said, his voice gentler than she'd heard it before, "I think there's been a bigger mistake here than you taking food from that store. And it's not your mistake." Shanice didn't understand what the judge meant, but something told her that this man with the serious face and kind eyes was about to change things. She just didn't know how much. Judge Kensington tapped his gavel gently against the wooden block. "We'll take a 15-minute recess," he announced, his voice echoing in the now silent courtroom. He looked directly at Shanice. "Young lady, I'd like to speak with you and Mrs. Taylor in my chambers." People started whispering immediately. This wasn't normal procedure, especially for a simple shoplifting case. The court officer, a tall man with gray hair at his temples, led Shanice and Mrs. Taylor through a side door while the judge disappeared behind his bench. The judge's chambers felt like a different world compared to the cold courtroom. Warm wooden bookshelves lined the walls, filled with thick law books and family photos. A window let in soft sunlight that made dust particles dance in the air. The room smelled like old books and coffee. Judge Kensington wasn't wearing his black robe anymore. In his white shirt and dark blue tie, he looked more like somebody's grandfather than the stern man who had been sitting on the bench minutes ago. "Please, sit down," he said, pointing to 2 comfortable chairs across from his desk. A clock ticked quietly on the wall as Shanice sat down, her legs swinging slightly because the chair was too high. "Would you like some water?" the judge asked, already pouring 3 glasses from a pitcher on his desk. Shanice nodded and took the glass with both hands. She drank it quickly, and the judge refilled it without a word. "Now," he said, sitting down in his own chair, "I'd like to hear more about your situation at home, Shanice. Just the truth, okay? You're not in any more trouble." Mrs. Taylor started to speak, but again the judge held up his hand. "I'd like to hear from Shanice first, if you don't mind." Shanice put her glass down carefully on a coaster. "My grandma takes care of me and my little brother Tommy since Mom passed 3 years ago," she began. Her voice was small but clear. "Grandma works cleaning offices at night and helps at the laundromat during the day when her back isn't too bad." Judge Kensington nodded, listening closely. He didn't interrupt or write anything down. He just watched Shanice's face as she spoke. "We were doing okay until last month when the help we get for food got cut." The letter said something about a mistake in the paperwork. Shanice shrugged. "Grandma tried to fix it, but she had to miss work to go to the office, and they told her to come back with more papers. We ran out of food 3 days ago, except for Tommy's cereal." The judge's eyebrows came together, making a deep line between them. "And where is your brother now?" "At the neighbor's. Mrs. Johnson watches him when Grandma's working. She gives him lunch sometimes," Shanice explained. Mrs. Taylor finally spoke up. "Your Honor, I've just been assigned this case today. I haven't had a chance to do a home visit yet, but—" "How many cases do you have right now, Mrs. Taylor?" the judge interrupted. Mrs. Taylor looked surprised by the question. 47 active cases, sir." 47 families or 47 children?" "Families, Your Honor." Her voice was tired. "Budget cuts last year reduced our department staff by 30%. The judge turned back to Shanice. "The food you took, was it just for you?" Shanice shook her head. "For Tommy too, and Grandma. She doesn't eat sometimes so we can have more, but then she gets too tired to work good." Something flickered across the judge's face, a mix of sadness and something else, something harder to name. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a granola bar. "Would you like this while we talk?" Shanice hesitated, then took it with a quiet thank you. She opened it carefully, making sure not to tear the wrapper too much. "Is your grandmother at work now?" the judge asked. "Yes, sir. She doesn't know I took the food. She told me to wait until Friday when she gets paid, but Tommy was crying 'cause his tummy hurt." Shanice took a small bite of the granola bar, chewing slowly like she wanted to make it last. The judge leaned back in his chair. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder in the silence. He looked at the family photos on his desk, then back at Shanice. "Mrs. Taylor," he said finally, "I'm going to do something unusual here." He reached for his phone. "Could you please get Mr. Wilson back in here?" and call the court clerk. "Tell him I need to clear my afternoon schedule." Mrs. Taylor looked confused but nodded and stepped outside. "Shanice," the judge said, his voice gentler than she'd heard it before, "I think there's been a bigger mistake here than you taking food from that store. And it's not your mistake." Shanice didn't understand what the judge meant, but something told her that this man with the serious face and kind eyes was about to change things. She just didn't know how much. Back in the courtroom, everyone sat up straighter when Judge Kensington returned to his bench. His black robe seemed to float around him as he took his seat. The room fell quiet, with only the shuffle of feet and the occasional cough breaking the silence. Shanice and Mrs. Taylor were already seated in the front row. Mr. Wilson, the store owner, had returned and was standing off to the side, looking confused about why he'd been called back. In the case of Shanice Williams, Judge Kensington began, his voice formal again, but somehow different from before. "I've decided to postpone any ruling for 48 hours. A murmur went through the courtroom. The court clerk looked up from his computer with surprise. In 10 years, no one could remember Judge Kensington ever delaying a ruling on such a straightforward case. Your Honor, the district attorney stood up, adjusting his tie nervously. This is a simple juvenile shoplifting case. With all due respect to the court's time. Thank you for your concern about the court's time, Mr. Parker, the judge cut in. But I believe there are extenuating circumstances that require further investigation. The district attorney looked like he wanted to say more but thought better of it and sat down. Judge Kensington continued, "This court will reconvene on Wednesday at 2 p.m. to issue a final ruling." He looked directly at Shanice. "Young lady, you are required to return at that time. Do you understand?" Shanice nodded, then remembered to speak up. "Yes, sir." "Mrs. Taylor," the judge turned to the social worker, "I'm assigning you specifically to conduct a home visit and prepare a full report on the Williams family situation before Wednesday." Mrs. Taylor looked worried. "Your Honor, as I mentioned, my caseload is—" "I've already spoken with your supervisor," Judge Kensington said. "2 of your cases have been temporarily reassigned to give you time for this priority matter." Mrs. Taylor's eyebrows shot up in surprise, but she nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." The judge then turned to Mr. Wilson. "Sir, I appreciate your patience in this matter. Would you be willing to meet with me privately after court today?" The store owner looked startled to be addressed directly. "Well, I suppose so, Your Honor. I've got the afternoon shift covered at the store." "Excellent." Judge Kensington nodded. "Court is adjourned until Wednesday." He tapped his gavel once, the sound sharp and final. As people began to file out of the courtroom, whispers filled the air. No one could figure out what was happening. Judge by-the-book Kensington never postponed rulings. He never spoke to store owners privately. And he certainly never interfered with social workers' caseloads. Outside the courtroom, Shanice stood with Mrs. Taylor, who was checking her phone. "Does this mean I can go home?" Shanice asked quietly. Mrs. Taylor nodded, putting her phone away. "Yes, for now. I'll be coming by your house tomorrow morning to meet your grandmother and brother. Is 9 o'clock okay?" "Grandma will be sleeping then. She works until 6 in the morning," Shanice explained. "I'll make it 11 then," Mrs. Taylor said, making a note in her small notebook. As they talked, neither noticed Judge Kensington watching them from the courthouse steps. He wasn't wearing his robe anymore, just a regular suit that made him look like any other man his age. But there was nothing ordinary about the thoughts running through his mind. The moment court had adjourned, he'd made a call to his wife, Barbara, canceling their dinner plans. Then he'd called his old friend Tom Henderson, who ran the local food bank. After that, he looked up the address for Shanice's neighborhood. Judge Kensington had been on the bench for 15 years. He'd seen thousands of cases, some sad, some troubling, some hopeful. But something about Shanice's simple words, "I was hungry," had gotten under his skin in a way nothing had for a long time. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the courthouse steps, the judge watched Shanice and Mrs. Taylor walk toward the bus stop. Then he turned and walked to his car, a man with a plan forming in his mind. A plan that would go far beyond one shoplifting case or one hungry child. What Judge Kensington didn't know was that his actions over the next 48 hours would send ripples through the community that no one could have predicted, not even himself. Judge Kensington's blue sedan looked out of place in Shanice's neighborhood. He drove slowly past rows of apartment buildings with peeling paint and rusted railings. Children played in the fenced lots between buildings, making up games with whatever they could find: a deflated basketball, a jump rope missing one handle, a shopping cart with a wobbly wheel. The judge parked his car and sat for a moment, taking it all in. This wasn't his first time in this part of town, but it had been years since he really looked at it. As a young lawyer, he'd volunteered at a legal aid clinic not far from here. Back then, he'd had big ideas about changing the system from the inside. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had gotten buried under case files and legal precedents. A tap on his window startled him. An older man with gray stubble and kind eyes peered in. "You lost, mister?" the man asked when Judge Kensington rolled down his window. "No, not lost. Just looking," the judge replied. "I'm trying to understand something about this neighborhood. The food situation, specifically." The man studied him for a moment. "You with the city?" "Sort of. I'm Judge Kensington from the county court. He didn't mention that he'd just postponed ruling on a case involving a hungry girl from this very neighborhood. Recognition flashed in the man's eyes. The tough judge? What brings you all the way out here? I'd like to see the local food bank if there is one. The man, who introduced himself as Mr. Washington, didn't ask any more questions. He simply pointed the judge toward a small brick building 2 blocks away. It's only open Tuesdays and Thursdays now. Budget cuts, they say. Judge Kensington thanked him and drove to the building. A faded sign read Community Food Assistance. The parking lot was empty except for one beat-up delivery van. The judge checked his watch, 4:30 p.m. on a Monday, and tried the door anyway. It was locked. He was about to leave when a woman came around from the back of the building carrying a clipboard. She was about his age, with streaks of gray in her dark hair, wearing a t-shirt with the food bank's logo. "We're closed until tomorrow," she called out, then stopped when she saw him. "Wait, aren't you Judge Kensington?" He nodded. "And you're Diane Russell. We met at that charity dinner last year. What brings you here?" She looked genuinely puzzled. "I had a case today. It made me realize I don't know enough about what's happening in this community," he admitted. "Could you spare a few minutes to talk?" 20 minutes later, they sat in the food bank's small office, surrounded by donation boxes and paperwork. The judge's neat tie was loosened, and he was scribbling notes as Diane talked. "We used to serve about 200 families a week. Now it's closer to 350, but with less food to go around," she explained. "The state funding got cut by 30% last year, and donations are down because everyone's feeling the pinch." "What about school meal programs?" the judge asked. "Breakfast and lunch during school days, yes, but weekends are hard for many families. We started a backpack program, sending kids home with food on Fridays, but we can only help about half the children who need it." Judge Kensington thought of Shanice giving half her school breakfast to her little brother. "And summer?" Diane sighed. "That's when we see the biggest spike in need. When school's out, some kids miss 10 meals a week they would have gotten at school." The judge's phone rang. It was Tom Henderson from the City Food Bank, a much larger operation downtown. "Tom, thanks for calling back," the judge said. "Listen, I need to know everything about how the Food Assistance Network operates in this city. Yes, especially in the East Side neighborhoods. Can you meet me tonight?" After hanging up, he turned back to Diane. "One more question. What's the biggest obstacle you face in getting food to the people who need it?" She didn't hesitate. "Transportation. Many families here don't have cars. The nearest big grocery store is 3 miles away. The corner stores charge twice as much for half the quality. That's why." She stopped suddenly. "That's why kids sometimes steal food," the judge finished quietly. Diane nodded. "I don't condone it, but I understand it." Judge Kensington stood up, a determined look on his face. "Thank you for your time. I need to make some more calls." By the time he got back to his car, the sun was setting. His phone showed 7 missed calls, 1 from his wife, wondering where he was, and 6 from people he'd reached out to after court. As he drove toward his meeting with Tom Henderson, his mind was racing with ideas, possibilities, and a growing sense that his role as a judge might be about to change in ways he never expected. Wednesday came faster than Shanice expected. Her grandmother, a small woman with work-worn hands and tired eyes, helped her get ready for court. Mrs. Taylor had visited their apartment the day before, asking lots of questions and writing everything down in her notebook. She'd brought a bag of groceries too, which made Shanice wonder if the judge had said something to her. "You look nice," Grandma said, smoothing down Shanice's collar. She'd ironed Shanice's best shirt, the one she usually saved for church. "Remember to speak clearly and tell the truth." Shanice nodded. "Do you think I'll be in trouble, Grandma?" Her grandmother sighed. "I don't know, baby, but we'll face it together." She glanced at the clock. "Mrs. Taylor should be here soon to pick us up." When they arrived at the courthouse, Shanice was surprised to see so many cars in the parking lot. Inside, the hallway outside courtroom 3 was packed with people. Some she recognized, Mr. Wilson from the store, Mrs. Taylor, the court clerk, but most were strangers. "What's going on?" A grandmother whispered to Mrs. Taylor. "Why are all these people here?" Mrs. Taylor shook her head, looking just as confused. "I'm not sure." The judge just told me to make sure you both came today. They found seats in the front row, where Mrs. Taylor had saved them spots. Shanice's little brother Tommy was with their neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, for the afternoon. Shanice was glad he didn't have to be here. Courtrooms made her nervous, and Tommy was only 7. At exactly 2 o'clock, the bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Kensington entered the room. He looked different somehow, still serious but with a kind of energy Shanice hadn't noticed before. His eyes scanned the packed courtroom and paused briefly when they found her. "Be seated," he said, settling into his chair. The rustle of people sitting down seemed louder than usual with so many people present. "Before we address the case of Shanice Williams," the judge began, "I'd like to introduce some guests who have joined us today." He gestured toward the gallery. "We have Mr. Chen and Ms. Lopez from Fresh Foods Markets." A middle-aged man and woman nodded from the third row. "Mr. Williams from Sunrise Bakery." Another nod from a tall man near the back. "Dr. Reynolds, Superintendent of Schools." A woman with short gray hair smiled slightly. "And representatives from several community organizations and churches." Shanice felt her grandmother tense beside her. "What is all this?" she whispered. "I've asked these community leaders to join us because what began as a simple shoplifting case has revealed a much larger issue," Judge Kensington continued. "An issue that requires more than a legal ruling. It requires a community solution." The courtroom was completely silent now, everyone hanging on the judge's words. "Mrs. Taylor," the judge said, "would you please share your findings from your home visit?" Mrs. Taylor stood, holding her notebook. "Your Honor, I found the Williams home to be clean and well-maintained, despite challenging circumstances. Ms. Williams, Shanice's grandmother, works 2 jobs totaling nearly 60 hours per week. Until recently, they received food assistance, but due to an administrative error and paperwork delays, their benefits were suspended 3 weeks ago." She continued, detailing how the family had stretched their resources until there was simply nothing left. How Shanice had never been in trouble before. How her school counselor described her as a helpful, responsible student who often looked out for younger children. When Mrs. Taylor finished, Judge Kensington turned to Shanice's grandmother. "Ms. Williams, would you be willing to speak with us today?" Shanice felt her grandmother's hand squeeze hers before she stood up. Though she was small in stature, there was a quiet dignity in the way she held herself. "I've raised these children since my daughter passed," she began, her voice soft but clear. "I do my best to provide for them. I've never asked for handouts, just the help I'm entitled to when I need it. The food assistance makes the difference between having enough and going hungry at the end of the month." She paused, then added, "I didn't know Shanice took that food. She was just trying to help her brother. I would have gone without myself if I'd known they were that hungry." There were murmurs of sympathy throughout the courtroom. Shanice saw Mr. Wilson from the stall looking down at his hands, his face troubled. Judge Kensington nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Ms. Williams." He turned his gaze to the entire courtroom. "What I've learned over the past 48 hours has convinced me that we need to address not just this case, but the conditions that led to it." No one in that courtroom, least of all Shanice, could have predicted what the judge would say next. Judge Kensington took off his glasses and placed them carefully on the bench in front of him. The courtroom remained utterly silent, everyone waiting to hear what he would say. "In the case of Shanice Williams," he began formally, then his voice softened. "I find that I cannot in good conscience punish a child for being hungry." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. "The charge of shoplifting is hereby dismissed," the judge continued. Shanice felt her grandmother's arm go around her shoulders, pulling her close, but Judge Kensington wasn't finished. "However," he said, raising his voice slightly to quiet the murmurs, "dismissing this case does nothing to address the underlying problem that brought us here today. And that problem is not unique to the Williams family." He stood up, something judges rarely did during proceedings. Without his usual seat of authority, he seemed more like a regular person, just a man with gray hair and concerned eyes, trying to do the right thing. "Over the past 2 days, I've visited food banks, spoken with school officials, and met with local business owners. What I've found is troubling. In this city, over 2,500 children go hungry on weekends and during school breaks. The East Side neighborhoods, where Shanice lives, are particularly affected because of limited transportation options and few grocery stores. He gestured toward the people he'd introduced earlier. These community leaders have agreed to join me in creating a new initiative called No Child Hungry, which will begin right here in Shanich's neighborhood. The judge picked up a paper from his bench. Mr. Chen and Ms. Lopez from Fresh Foods Markets have committed to opening a weekly produce stand at the community center, selling fruits and vegetables at reduced prices. They'll also donate all unsold but still good produce to the local food bank instead of throwing it away. Mr. Chen nodded from his seat, a small smile on his face. Mr. Williams from Sunrise Bakery has offered to provide bread and baked goods to supplement the weekend backpack program for schoolchildren, the judge continued. And Dr. Reynolds has agreed to extend the school breakfast and lunch programs through the summer months at 3 East Side schools. Shanice glanced at her grandmother, whose eyes had grown wide with surprise. Additionally, Judge Kensington said, I've spoken with the Department of Social Services. They've agreed to fast-track the Williams family's food assistance reinstatement and review their procedures to prevent similar paperwork delays for other families. Mrs. Taylor was nodding now, scribbling notes furiously. But perhaps most importantly, the judge said, his voice growing more passionate, I am personally committing to establish a permanent food distribution center at the East Side Community Building. I've pledged $25,000 of my own money to renovate the space and stock it initially. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Judges didn't normally announce personal donations from the bench. I'm challenging other community members who can afford it to match my contribution, he added. Our court clerk has information packets for anyone interested in donating or volunteering. He turned specifically to face Mr. Wilson, the store owner. Sir, what do you think about all this? Mr. Wilson stood up, clearly not expecting to be called on. He cleared his throat nervously. Well, Your Honor, I never wanted to get the girl in trouble. I just get frustrated with the stealing. But this plan, he glanced at Shanice and her grandmother. This sounds like it might actually help. I'd like to contribute too. Maybe I could set up a donation box in my store. Judge Kensington smiled. That would be an excellent contribution, Mr. Wilson. Thank you. The judge turned back to face the entire courtroom. This is just the beginning. The easy part is making announcements and promises. The hard work comes in the days ahead, making sure these plans become reality. He looked directly at Shanice now. Young lady, would you be willing to help with this initiative? Perhaps by volunteering at the food center once it's established. Shanice felt dozens of eyes turn toward her. Her throat felt dry, but she managed to stand up. Yes, sir, she said clearly. I would like that. Excellent, the judge nodded. Then instead of community service as punishment, you'll have community service as participation. This court is adjourned until the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the new food center 6 months from today. He tapped his gavel once, but instead of the usual rush to leave, people began talking excitedly in small groups. Several approached Shanice and her grandmother with handshakes and words of encouragement. No one could quite believe what had just happened, least of all Shanice herself. 6 months later, a crowd gathered outside the newly renovated East Side Community Building. Colorful balloons danced in the breeze, and a long red ribbon stretched across the entrance. A hand-painted sign hung above the door. Community Food Center, No Child Hungry. Shanice stood near the front of the crowd, wearing a volunteer t-shirt that matched the sign's colors. Her grandmother stood proudly beside her, looking healthier than she had in months. Little Tommy bounced excitedly next to them, clutching a small box of apple juice. Look, there he is. Tommy pointed as Judge Kensington arrived, dressed not in his usual black robe, but in regular clothes, khaki pants, and a blue button-up shirt. The judge smiled and waved as he made his way through the crowd, stopping to shake hands and chat with people. When he reached Shanice, his smile grew wider. Are you ready for the big day? He asked. Shanice nodded. Yes, sir. I've been practicing my speech all week. You're going to do wonderfully, he assured her. The last 6 months had been a whirlwind of activity. What had started as a simple court case had grown into something that was changing the whole neighborhood. The judge's initial donation had sparked others to contribute. Local businesses, church groups, and even some of the judge's wealthy friends had matched his $25,000, and then some. Mrs. Taylor had worked overtime helping families like Shanice's get their food assistance back on track. Mr. Wilson's store donation box had collected enough money to buy a delivery van, which now brought groceries to elderly neighbors who couldn't walk to the store. But the biggest change was this building. Once a neglected community center that was only open for voting days and occasional meetings, it was now a bright, welcoming space. Inside were food storage rooms, a teaching kitchen where people could learn to cook healthy meals on a budget, and a dining area where families could eat together during tough times. Judge Kensington stepped up to the microphone set up near the ribbon. The crowd quieted down. 6 months ago, he began, a brave young girl stood in my courtroom and told the simple truth: she was hungry. That moment changed how I see my job as a judge. It reminded me that true justice isn't just about following rules. It's about making sure everyone has what they need to live with dignity. He gestured to the building behind him. This food center is just the beginning. Already, 3 other neighborhoods have started similar programs. The school district's summer meal program has expanded to 5 more schools. And next month, the city council will vote on a transportation plan to help people from food deserts reach grocery stores more easily. The crowd applauded, and Shanice felt a surge of pride. She'd helped make this happen, not by stealing food, but by telling the truth about being hungry. Now, the judge continued, I'd like to introduce someone very special. She's been volunteering here 3 days a week, helping organize food deliveries and teaching younger children about nutrition. Please welcome Shanice Williams. Shanice took a deep breath and walked up to the microphone. 6 months ago, she couldn't have imagined speaking in front of so many people. But now, looking out at the friendly faces, Mr. Wilson from the store, Mrs. Taylor the social worker, Dr. Reynolds from the school district, and dozens of neighbors, she felt calm. My name is Shanice, she began, her voice clear and strong. 6 months ago, I was caught stealing food because my family was hungry. I was scared and ashamed. But Judge Kensington didn't just see me as a kid who broke the rules. He saw me as a person who needed help. She looked back at the judge, who nodded encouragingly. This food center has already helped over 500 families in our neighborhood. Kids don't have to go to bed hungry anymore. Parents don't have to skip meals so their children can eat. And nobody has to feel like they're alone when times get hard. Shanice pointed to a wall inside the center, visible through the open door. It was covered with colorful handprints, each one made by a child or family who had been helped by the program. Every handprint tells a story, she said, and every story matters. Thank you, Judge Kensington, for listening to mine. The crowd erupted in applause as Shanice and the judge cut the ribbon together. As people streamed into the center for the celebration, Shanice's grandmother wrapped her arms around her. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. Shanice looked around at the community that had come together because one person, one judge, had chosen to see beyond a simple case of shoplifting. She thought about all the children who wouldn't have to feel the gnawing pain of hunger because of what had happened here. I'm proud of us all, she said simply, and together they walked through the doors of the building that had once been just a dream.